Welcome to episode 5 of the Necronommy.com. At 6:01 p.m., April 4th, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He was rushed to the hospital and pronounced dead within an hour at the age of 39. His death sent shockwaves throughout the country and around the world, resulting in riots in more than 100 cities throughout the United States. During this time of national mourning, President Lyndon Johnson asked Americans to reject the blind violence that had killed King, who he had known as being an apostle of nonviolence. Among those who heard the news of Dr. King's death were filmmaker George Romero, who had a copy of his film Night of the Living Dead in the trunk of his car on his way to take it to distributors. He didn't know it at the time, but the film would have a lasting impact, not only in film, but within American culture and history. Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Necronommy.com. I'm Don Guillory, author, historian, and co-host of this podcast.
And I am James Sabata, author, screenwriter, co-host of this podcast, and huge fan of Don Guillory.
Aww. All right, this week we are talking about George Romero's 1968 classic, Night of the Flesh Eater. Oh, no, that's right. It's not Night of the Flesh Eaters, which was the original title. It is Night of the Living Dead, that we all have grown accustomed to calling it kind of the foundation of zombie horror. But in no way, no how in this film is the word zombie, zombies, Walking Dead, or anything like that used to describe the monsters.
Romero was actually trying to start an all-new kind of monster. To him, zombie was reminiscent of Haitian culture and the stories there.
And it's funny that you mentioned that, because when we talked about Candyman last week and you asked about within African-American culture or black culture, you know, the types of urban legends and myths that exist. You know, the zombie thing is part of it, but then there's so much cultural impact and cultural play with it. It's not seen as a myth or legend because of the power that voodoo culture itself has, especially in places like Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and even Santeria itself. The idea that this is not anything that's mythical or mythological, it's part of religious practices. But today we're going to talk about Night of the Living Dead, its place in horror, its place in history, its place, I would even argue, within the civil rights movement as far as being impacted by it and impacting it as well. Because probably the most profound thing about this film, for me, at least in my estimation, is the casting of Duane Jones. Duane Jones was cast and won the role of Ben. And originally, he was supposed to be a truck driver, kind of a dim-witted truck driver guy, and he wasn't specifically supposed to be a black character. And some people attribute it to, you know, he did so well at the audition, he ended up getting the role. But George Romero, you know, people argued there was a little bit of color blindness with the way that he was casting and then trying to rewrite the role because he wasn't thinking about the impact of it. But he didn't want his lead character, who is now going to be played or portrayed by a black actor, to be dim-witted, because then it falls into all these tropes that we can get into with things like the Sambo trope or the step and fetch it type tropes, really negative attributes linked to those characters. And he didn't want this guy to have it.
And what I like about that is Duane got to write a lot of how his character would be. And I don't know how many people know this, but most of the film is actually improv. They went in with, this is what we're doing in this scene, do it the way your character would do. And that gave him extra power. So it's not like the script was word for word already and then they changed anything with him. So I think that's a real strength to it as well, because it is completely what Duane wants the character to be at that point.
And that gives you, at least from the outside, or at least from my estimation as a black male who would have watched this film as a kid in the 80s, because that was when I would have watched it. I think my dad even pushed me to watch it, but he didn't tell me why he was wanting me to watch it. You know, I just looked at it as, my dad likes horror movies, I like horror movies, we're going to watch this. Oh shit, there are these zombies. I'm thinking that in my head because I wasn't going to say it out loud around, 6, 7 years old. But I'm thinking to myself like, oh shit, there are all these zombies and monsters, pulling my shirt up over my face not to see people getting eaten, because during that period, that would have been scary. But
absolutely,
when I saw Duane Jones, I looked at it as, holy shit, who's this black guy who's in charge? But I didn't think about it in the 1980s of how impactful that would have been in the 1960s. Because, for lack of a better phrase, a lot of black characters were neutered. They were almost presented as asexual. And this is no slight to somebody like Sidney Poitier, but in the previous year, 1967, the same year that the Loving versus Virginia decision took place by the Supreme Court, you had Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. And I've watched the film. I've used the film in my courses to teach about the time period, but also teach about segregation, teach about intermarriage, miscegenation. There isn't one time in which Sidney Poitier's character, who is educated, has money, comes from a good family, a stable family. There's not one time that in which he kisses his soon-to-be white wife. Not once. And I think there are very few times where they even show that there's any type of interaction between them that's even sort of romantic. So Duane Jones, when he takes this role, it's very powerful, or at least his character is very powerful as Ben, because he's in charge. And I cringe when I say this because it can be a compliment, but it can also be it can also take advantage of negative stereotypes. He's very articulate in the film. So he's being presented, one, with male characteristics as being strong. He's being defiant of the folks that are in the house. He's not stepping back. He's not emasculating himself. He basically stands up to the point against these people who don't like him. And I mean, the more you watch the film, the more you see this nuance of the 7 people, or the other 7 people, or however many people that were in the house, don't trust him. For some reason, this guy who's in the house, who's trying to stay alive just like the rest of them, they're fearful of him, that he's going to do something. Meanwhile, you have all these fucking zombies outside that are coming to kill and eat you. But they're scared of the one black guy who happens to be in the house, and he doesn't give a damn what they think about him. Because his goal is, I'm going to make it through this night, or however long I have to be here, with or without you guys. To the point where there's some very controversial scenes for the time period. Looking back on it now, as far as 2019, say you're in your teen years, your early 20s, your first time you've seen it in 2019, you're not going to bat an eyelash other than the time that he slaps Barbara's character, because you just think of it as like, oh, well, you shouldn't hit a woman, that's violence, that, there's all types of nuance there with respect to gender and power dynamics. But for a 1960s audience, they're not looking at it as, oh, it's a guy who slapped a woman, because, to be honest, there was a lot of that going on in films. John Wayne, the Mr. Americana, there are several films where he slaps women and is very brutal towards women.
I think that's actually the plot of McClintock. Like, how many times can I hit her?
And even other films like the one I hate watch, Gone with the Wind, where Scarlett O'Hara's telling Rhett Butler, no, 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 and he's telling her, like, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and take it. Or even simpler ones like hyper-sexed characters like Pepe Le Pew. I'm not taking no for an answer. As far as a sexual pursuit. There's nothing sexual between Duane Jones and the character Barbara, other than the fact that he is male, she is female. In the 1960s lens, you have to multiply that with race, or compound that with race. He is a black male, she is a white female.
That's something that I really like that they did, because they stay really consistent to which characters react to him being black. And you can argue that her brother just died and she went through all this trauma, and that's the issue. But the looks she gives him when he's trying to board up the house, or just like when they first start and he's talking nonstop and she's just sitting there, like, those looks are so ingrained with, even if it's not intentional, like Romero says, it's still there for the viewer. You still can add that to what you see in Barbara's looks. Same with Mr. Cooper downstairs. Like, he always distrusts Ben, okay? Tommy, the kid, or not kid, but the young guy, he instantly wants to listen to him. And his girlfriend, Judy, is kind of stuck in between, but she's more open to it. It's fantastic to me how they kept those so consistent throughout. It's not like Tommy changes along the way. Cooper's always distrustful. Barbara's always a little weirded out about it. And I really, really like how they did that. And I think that probably is an added part of originally writing it for a white person because it wasn't necessarily there. And so it was more how they were reacting to him, maybe as a stranger or an outsider. You were talking about Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and how they didn't kiss. The first interracial kiss on TV, of course, was Uhura and Captain Kirk.
U.S.
I looked
TV.
it up. U.S. TV, yes. I looked it up and...
Because there was one in Britain before.
I looked it up and it was November of 1968.
Yeah, just how long it takes for that to happen. But even if you look at that one, to compare these two films with race and gender dynamics, Uhura's black female, Kirk is white male. That has almost always been okay. I mean, when we start looking through history with anti-miscegenation laws, I mean, you can go back and talk about the antebellum period or talk about the previous slavery period of the 18th century, not just the 19th century. It was okay if you're a white slave owner or a white male to get with a black female or an Indian female. But the other way around, the other way was not okay. And it always had to deal with domination of the white female body, muddying, your racial lineage. I mean, there's all types of crazy terminology. But with Ben, you get to have this moment where anyone who is already uncomfortable with him being there, as far as the audience members, they may also be uncomfortable with the way he's talking to Barbara, not just because she's, I guess a sympathetic character because of what she's already gone through, but the look in her eyes. And that's what always draws me in. When he's boarding up those windows and those doors, the way she kind of cowers, I think, next to the refrigerator or next to the kitchen
She
table.
literally grabs onto everything. It's the fridge, it's the wall, It's the window. She's always pushing to get out, but stay inside.
Yeah, and she's trying to get as much space between her and him as possible. But the look that she gives him is very reminiscent of another film that I would never recommend anybody watch. All you have to do is get the summary, see a couple little short clips on YouTube, which is Birth of a Nation, which is heavily reliant on the William Dunning lost cause narrative of the South was thrust into this position of having to fight the Civil War, which anyone who has a basic knowledge of the Civil War knows that's complete BS. I forgot we're on the podcast. Complete bullshit. They know that that's the case, but...
Did you just curse more because we're recording?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
But that's where a lot of those ideas start getting ingrained about, all these free Negroes are going to be running around, and guess what? They're going to be coming for your daughters, fellas. So you better do something. You better be prepared because you don't want any of these colored babies running around. Because what'll happen is these black guys are going to get your daughters pregnant or your sisters pregnant, and they're going to run off and they're going to leave you with these kids. Like all those stereotypes, all those things started. Well, I shouldn't say all of them, but they started to get a deeper foundation in the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction period, to where a film in 1968, it's not even, throw in the one in 1967 with Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, but a film in 1968 is still going to have that tension even when sex is not part of the scenario. What is he going to do to her? Whereas an audience member, you're not, especially now, 2019, you're not thinking about it in those same, if you've evolved as a human being, you're not thinking of it like that. Your thought pattern is, holy shit, there are a lot of zombies outside. What do we do to survive? And what it really shows you, at least this film, to get into, some of the other social commentary, this film is a commentary on not just the civil rights movement, but it's a commentary on human nature themselves. How people react in a situation like this. How people are going to distrust each other. How you're going to become, these primal urges are going to come out with respect to violence. Who you're going to trust, who you're going to distrust.
Who are you going to save?
Yeah. Who's worth saving?
I think all zombie stories kind of took that from this. I can't think of a single zombie story where the point isn't what humanity's doing. Zombies are always an afterthought.
Mm-hmm.
Any story that features zombies or flesh-eating ghouls or whatever else we're calling them, it's never about them, unless you count like Warm Bodies, where it's literally about them. But even then, it's the humanity in those bodies. And I think that it started with this film.
Well, you had no other places. You had a lot of films themselves, sci-fi films, horror movies that were coming out in the 1950s where, or even the Westerns, you could throw those in, where there was a lot of political discussion or political subtext with respect to communism and all the other things that come with communism. Equal rights, apparently, was one of the big threats.
No!
I know. But you're looking at this in the 1960s. When the film comes out, we're not that far removed from the 68 riots nationwide, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, the assassination of Martin Luther King. Vietnam is going on at the same time. Roughly 15 years prior, you would have had the Emmett Till lynching that takes place. 13 years prior, you had the Birmingham bus boycott. You had all these aspects where people are trying to fight. They're trying to assert their equality within society without violently fighting back. But then you reach the 60s and you have more riots, you have a lot of civil unrest. And for some people who are going to be watching the film, you just had the riots take place in your city. This film comes out months after the riots. There might still be stuff, part of the city that's smoldering. You're watching this, and yeah, you start to think, not just in the terms of race, but you start to see the real world application of what's taking place. Duane Jones, or at least the combination of Duane Jones and even Max Brooks, who wrote World War Z, they were basically stating, and Duane Jones did this in 68 and some subsequent interviews, and saying, the zombies are not the monsters. We're the monsters. And once you look at it that way, everything makes a whole lot more sense. And just like you said, the zombies in all these other films, or I should say in just about all the films, are an afterthought. They're just that external thing that slowly, unless, like we have the souped up zombies like in Dawn of the Dead, the remake with Zack Snyder's remake. Unless you have the souped up zombies that can run, climb, jump, and do whatever else they can do, the zombies are slowly moving towards you. They're not really a threat. They're a threat if they're in your close proximity. What you really have to worry about now is, what is everybody else around me going to do? Are you going to get me killed because of a bad decision? And if I fear that you're going to make a bad decision, what am I going to do to stop you from doing that? Or should I just go ahead and kill you now because we're running low on supplies? I don't trust you, and I better kill you before you have the chance to kill me or get me killed. This film kind of kicks it up a notch, because now you're analyzing this with a personal perspective. What the hell would I do in this situation? How could I make it out? The only problem I have, well, there are a couple of problems I have with this film, but only because they were right to do it. The idea that Duane Jones' character Ben falls into one trope that's been used in other films before, and it's sacrificial Negro, where that black person typically the person has to die, but they sacrifice themselves for whatever the white characters are in the film. Sometimes it's kids, sometimes it's a woman, but they're sacrificing themselves for somebody else, and you see him over and over again, not necessarily sacrificing himself to where he dies in order for somebody else to live, but he's consistently risking himself.
See, I took that as he wants to be in control and he doesn't trust these bitches. Like, you're not sending Mr. Cooper out there. That dude, can't handle locking a door. Mm-hmm. And you definitely can't send Helen out. She's downstairs with Karen. And so you can't send her. Tommy goes with him. And then Judy is just stupid as shit and follows him out there without being safe about it. So to me, it wasn't so much sacrifice. It was, if I want this done, I gotta fucking do it, because Tommy's the only one that's really helping me.
But I mean, as far as sacrificial, as far as he stays up top, he could have gone in the basement and kicked everybody else out and said, fuck you guys. Anybody who comes down here, I'm shooting. But he stays above ground. So it's kind of like, I'm the one who has to save everybody. I'm trying to save myself, but I'm the one who has to save everybody, because it's not going to be done right. And that's what I mean by him sacrificing himself. He's putting himself at risk to make sure that all these other people don't perish. Even to the point where, it's this very powerful scene, almost as powerful as the slapping scene, which we'll get into, I guess, in a little bit more depth in a second. But that moment where he tells Cooper, says, you go down there, you can be the boss down there, I'm the boss up here. And 1968 film, I wish, now this is not a thing that black people can do. We're not allowed to time travel, because history has not been at least U.S. history has not been too accommodating. But I would love to time travel and go into a theater in some place like Detroit, Chicago, somewhere where a black audience is watching this, and he tells, Cooper, basically, get the fuck downstairs. I'm handling shit. It is really what it would be today. as opposed to you go down there, you be the boss down there, I'm the boss up here. I would love to have seen a 1960s audience in the midst of the high points of the civil rights movement, despite the assassinations of Malcolm X in 65 and the assassination of Dr. King in 68. But the fact that their rights are being protected, you're getting more protections with respect to housing, with jobs. Now the issue is about changing the hearts and minds and also standing up. There's more Afrocentrism towards the mid to late 1960s. There's the Black Power movement kicks off. And just that idea of Ben telling this white man, I'm not taking shit from you, go downstairs, is just powerful in its own regard, because I can guarantee you that there were a lot of people that were standing up, clapping, cheering, to the point where you couldn't hear anything for probably another 30, 45 seconds.
Shit, I'd like to be in that theater now.
I would love it.
If they showed it today.
I guarantee you, because Get Out has been compared to this film, or these two films have been compared to each other, but it would be the same as those scenes where Chris finally, for lack of a better term, he wakes up and he starts fighting back. It would be the same thing as when, Chris stabs the dad with the buck, or he beats the brother to death with, what was it, a bocce ball or something? Where he beats him to death. Where people, every time because I screened it about 4 times.
Do we get paid for every reference we make to Get Out? Because I feel like we should.
I don't know. I'm going to start handing out some screenplays to Mr. Peele. I'm sorry, Academy Award-winning screenwriter, Mr. Jordan Peele. But just the idea of what we saw in 2017, with the racial animosity, the racial division that was being sown by certain individuals, even prior to the Charlottesville riots that took place, whether some people want to classify them as riots or not. Because when the film came out in February, we were already in that post-election, post-inaugural moment, and post Nazis being able to feel as though they could walk freely and say certain things on the streets of America. And then we get to the fall, and people are still having these discussions watching this film. I can't imagine that it would be too different than in 2017 with Get Out, or at least the reaction to Get Out with multicultural audiences.
It's interesting that you mention being post anything. Romero talked about how Duane Jones was worried about being the black main lead, and Romero at the time felt, what are you talking about? We're all post-racial. We're past that. And in the interview I watched with him, which was several years ago, obviously, he starts laughing and he's like, clearly we weren't, but we thought we were at the time. Mm-hmm. And he was talking about how the rest of the cast had no issue with it. And Duane was the only one that kept bringing it up. And they were like, why do you keep talking about this? It doesn't matter. And then when he was in the car and he heard the news about MLK getting shot, Romero was like, holy crap, he was right. Mm-hmm. Like, this is gonna blow up, and this is the direction it's gonna go in now.
Because Duane Jones at the time, and I might have already mentioned this, but as part of those discussions with Romero, he was saying this. I mean, once he saw the finished product, it's like, this film is a commentary on the civil rights movement and race relations in America. Whether we want to acknowledge it or not, one, it's going to be magnified because I'm the lead, and part of it has to deal with that ending, which we'll get to. Again, the racial dynamics that are at play, Romero's sense of color blindness that he has at this time, and even the cast, and it might have to deal with, one, again, where they're shooting the film, who's being cast in it. I would love to see a southern version of this, or just a version in the South, not in Atlanta, because Atlanta, for all my folks in Georgia, if not for Atlanta, Georgia would be Alabama. And anyone from Georgia, especially from Atlanta, knows that to be true. And I say this as somebody who went to college in Statesboro, Georgia, at Georgia Southern University. There is a vast difference between Atlanta and the rest of Georgia. But I would love to see it in the South. If you had this in the 1960s in the South, what would it look like? And for some people, I think that scene, the ending scene with where Ben is killed, would be even more poignant, because you've got Freedom Summer takes place in 63, 64. You have the Selma marches in 65. You have all these things that are taking place where white people from the North, from the Midwest, from the West, and even within the South are trying to rebel against groups like the KKK, the White Citizens Council, the old order, the good old boy system, and trying to get people enfranchised, whether that's through voting, through any other type of political power, like being put on a jury, economic power as well. But I think that's the power that at least a different version geographically would have, as opposed to just holding it in Pennsylvania. I think that plays into what George Romero's original plan and intent was. I'm just going to make a new type of monster movie. I'm not even thinking about making this for social commentary or any type of political reach.
Well, and that's the thing. Romero didn't set out to make it about race, and he didn't set out to make zombies, and he didn't even set out to give birth to slashers, but he did all of those in this film. So I'm actually going to switch this for a second and go in a different direction, and then we're going to come back, because I feel like people miss how much this movie influences horror as a whole.
Yes.
Before we even get to the other stuff. So as I was rewatching it this morning, I'm paying attention to all these horror tropes that constantly happen now, but at the time they didn't. And even in the very first scene, the almighty, "They're coming to get you, Barbara" scene.
Right.
As she's running away from the first ghoul, she falls and then lays there and stares at the threat for a while. I don't want to say the killer, but the threat. She just lays there after falling, and that became such a horror cliche after this.
The white woman who trips and falls while running away.
Absolutely. So you have that. She runs into a farmhouse right there. That's become a trope, running into the house, She goes upstairs, which, hello, that's a trope. Fascinating thing about the going upstairs, when she goes upstairs, she sees this decomposing person that's basically had their face eaten off. And I guess that scene was so terrifying that people in the audience were literally throwing up or leaving the theater. Just this shot that, it's still really well done. It still looks fantastic. But so she ran upstairs. That's a trope. Then you have the dead body at the top of the stairs. That's a trope. Not trusting people. The phone not working. That's a trope.
There's the person that is obviously going to become a monster, or at least if we're in the zombie genre. The person that's obviously going to become one, but no one knows it other than the audience.
One of the things I really like is that very first ghoul in the cemetery picks up a rock to break a window. And we have so few times now that zombies, or whatever you want to call them, use tools. And I love that this movie uses tools, whether it's that one, whether it's the trowel towards the end, whether it's, hitting the door to get in, that kind of stuff. You just never see that in other zombie movies, and I love it.
No, it's typically them using their bodies to get through whatever the barricade is. They might rip the boards that get put up on the windows or on the door, but that's pretty much it. Because when I think about this movie, I think about it's Return of the Living Dead. I think it came out in the 80s. You had Dawn of the Dead in 1978, the original. But, these movies, they were clearly trying to make some social commentary, where 78 was about consumerism and capitalism. The one in the 80s, Return of the Living Dead, was about government, nuclear weapons, and I guess even to an extent it was about recycling. So you have the clear commentary in those other films, whereas this one, the commentary is more built off of the time, as far as the time period, the social and political circumstances, and people like George Romero, they can make the claim, I did not intend to make this film for social commentary. But there's a quote that I love using for my classes, I love using on panels, is from Charlie Chaplin. And it's, "Don't look for any social commentary in my films or political meaning, because there is none." And it's the same thing with this film. Even though he doesn't set out to, with the intention of making a film about the civil rights movement, about racial issues, about America as as an allegory, this film as an allegory for America, he does. And casting Duane Jones in the space of Ben and allowing him to have that freedom to help build the character, you then create the social commentary, because now Duane Jones is going to take all the shit that he's gone through or known other people to go through and put it into that character. How would a black guy in a room full of white people that don't trust him react when there's all this other shit out there trying to kill him? So you guys don't trust me. I know there's some shit outside trying to kill me. You might not trust me, but you know what? I'm going to do whatever I can to make it. If that includes, I just have to suck up your bigoted attitudes, your racism, whatever else is going on, I'm going to do it because right now that's not important. My pride my pride can take that hit. Watching this again, as a child, as a teenager, as an adult, as an academic, there are all these things that come out. Duane Jones, I want to give him credit for this because I think it was attributed to him. For Jordan Peele especially, the characters were about responding to those stresses, those social stresses that they see every day. So whether we're talking about Ben or we're talking about Chris, it's all the stuff that they've been going through every day outside of the day that you see them. That's what's making them react in a certain way. That's what's making Ben stand up to Cooper and say, you get down there, you can be in charge down there, I'm in charge up here. So it's all about survival. In all honesty, part of me even thinks that Cooper and these other people want to keep Ben around, not to sacrifice him, but he's somebody else who can help. So whatever their racial animosity might be, and they might not have any, but whatever their racial insecurity they might have, they're going to suspend that because they realize he's not one of them, but right now he's one of us. We can get back to not liking you for whatever superficial reason that there is tomorrow or whenever we become safe. I mean, it really becomes the next day because the threat is pretty much over. And even the what's really cool that you mentioned the tropes. What's really cool is they include the trope of the newscasters telling you what's good. The newscaster serving as the narrator, where you get to hear what's taking place in the outside world.
Well, they actually do a ton of exposition throughout this entire film, whether it's Ben telling the story of everything that happened before he got there, or Barbara hysterically reiterating the stuff we've already seen, or, like you said, the newscasters bringing us up to speed on how it's all over the place, as well as telling you, hey, go for the brain, because, that's not common knowledge at that point. And right. What I do like about it is that the exposition doesn't feel as forced as it does in some films. I do feel there's a couple scenes where Ben should have kept boarding the house while he was talking instead of just sitting there. Especially when he says, this place is really well fortified and the window right behind him has no boarding on it and it's wide open.
Right.
But that's probably just a filming mistake. Overall, it doesn't feel as forced as it does in some movies. Some movies, it feels like everything grinds to a halt so that we can tell you the backstory.
Now, to the painful part of this movie. Now, again, I love this movie. The problems that I have with it are, one, for anybody who's listening, I'm not saying the film is problematic. Because, sometimes people can misconstrue what you're saying. I'm not saying the film is problematic. What I'm saying is the problem I have with the film is that the ending is too real. It's way too real for me. Because even as a kid, when I watched this film, and even now when I watch it, I'm like, come on, Ben's going to make it. Ben's going to make it. Ben's going to make it. God damn it. Again. I've seen the movie countless times, but I still sit there and think, like, he's going to make it this time. But at the end of the film, again, spoiler alert, those of you who haven't seen it, Ben does not survive. He survives the night, and he survives the zombies. He survives the paranoia of people like Barbara, Cooper, everybody else who happens to be in the house.
A truck that's on fire, a gas pump that he's holding on to while the fire is right there. He survives literally being the only person outside with like 20 zombies on him. Ghouls, whatever.
Flesh eaters.
Yeah, he survives a lot of stuff.
As a kid, as I just said, as a kid, I watched this ending, and all the hope that I have is dashed at the ending. And when I say that you can watch this film from, the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, or even people originally saw it in the 60s and 70s, the ending has different meaning based off the generations or when you're watching it. We're in 2019, just a few years ago, or even depending on how where you happen to live. But just a few years ago, we had the Trayvon Martin murder. We had Philando Castile, Sandra Bland. So you see all these moments where black faces, male and female, as well as within the trans community, their lives are being extinguished. So for people who are seeing this, it's like, oh, I've got so much hope that this person, they just graduated high school, they graduated college, or they're on honor roll, or they just got that job, and then their life is brought to a screeching halt. And that's what you have with Ben, where you're thinking this guy's going to make it. This is great. It's going to be a great ending. It's going to be a happy and joyous ending. And then you see this posse, this armed posse walking through shooting all the zombies because they know they're supposed to be shooting them in the head. And they see Ben through the window, and one of the men shoots him. What kills me is not just that he's shot. More than just the idea that he doesn't make it is another one for the fire. And there are all types of connotations with that, because the mob that's showing up, the posse that's showing up, is reminiscent of lynch mobs. Now we can excuse it away because it's a zombie film, but as far as the meaning that it has, especially if you're African American, is the film's in black and white. It's an all-white posse that kills him, or all the members of the posse that show up are white. They're going to burn his body, but the still images that are at the end of the film look just like still images that you would see in textbooks, within museums, within historical documentaries. They all look like lynching photos. And it's very scary. It's very creepy. In fact, the ending of the film is scarier than anything else that takes place in the film. And I made that comment earlier about traveling in time, but I would really like to see, but then also part of me doesn't want to see what that reaction would have been like for a 1968 black or multicultural audience that just had to deal with the death of Dr. King.
So for me, the ending is pure horror. Like, you leave everything else the same, but Ben's played by a white guy. That ending is fucking terrifying. It was something that they weren't doing at the time. You're not expecting it. You're expecting Ben to survive. As much as the line, "he's dead," bothers me, that's what they're out there doing. And there's no other term for it. It's not... This isn't something you're used to. This started yesterday. So like, if you were shooting regular zombies, you would probably still say, okay, that one's dead. So to me, if you replace Ben and that's gone, that line is still fucking horrific. It's still your hero who survived all this shit, and then bam. And I love how fast it is. I know you don't. I love it. I love that there's nothing he could have done. There's nothing he can change. It's instantly fucking over. We don't have this long, drawn-out death like, I don't know, I always come back to the Sheriff of Nottingham in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, where his death scene lasts like 7 minutes. We don't have any of that kind of shit. Like, it's just pop and he's gone.
Well, I have no problem with the time of it. What I'm saying, it's still terrifying, but it's still one of those things where it's so dramatic in its expediency, where it's done and you're sitting there thinking like, holy shit. No. It's the same feeling we all had for about 2 seconds. Again, another Get Out reference. For about 2 seconds when Chris sees those flashing lights at the end of the movie. You just start to think like, no, not like this. Not like, it can't end like this.
Well, but that's what I like about this, is there is no out.
Right.
It's just fucking done. And I think that must have been so shocking as an audience at that point. We're talking a time when Marion Crane's death in Psycho was like horrifying, So having something like this that nobody's doing at the time, and it's instantly over. Like, it's just that gigantic kick in the nuts right there.
But the shock of it, though. Because, what was the other one? There are a few comedians and a few historians and cultural scholars who remarked about what would happen if we had a black president. Eddie Murphy had a sketch as part of his comedy routine where he gives a speech as the first black president, and he's running from left to right on the stage and ducking as he's doing it. This is back in the 80s. I think it was during his stand-up special Raw. Dave Chappelle made the same type of jokes about back in 2000, if it would happen. And when Obama was elected as president and the inauguration happened, I had white friends, black friends within academia and outside that all said the same thing. And I was watching the inauguration with two white women, one around my age and one about 20, 30 years older. And they both said the same thing. don't get out of the car, because there was this moment where he gets out of the limousine and then walks down the street with Secret Service, and they were sitting there like, please don't get out of the car, don't get out of the car. And the images that started hitting my head were the same thing. It was Ben, it was MLK, it was Malcolm X, it was Medgar Evers. It was all these people that had participated in the civil rights movement that had been gunned down. Fred Hampton. And so they were sitting there thinking like, please don't get out of the car because somebody will try something. And then what we found, shortly into his first 4 years was he had, I think it was about 4 or 5 times the amount of death threats any other president had had. Some people were remarking they hadn't seen death threats of that level since King and even Jackie Robinson. But just the idea that was taking place. So, let's to bring it full circle, that was a fear in 68 that becomes reality. It's a fear that exists in the film, and it's a fear that kind of continues on, where people are very fearful of, if there is a prominent leader of color, especially if there's a prominent black leader, that person can be snuffed out very quickly and thrown into the pile. Any other film that you're looking at, we could see a resolution at the end of this film, or hopefully at the end of this film, as far as epilogue, where if somebody comes out and says, no, he was helping us, he wasn't one of them, just kind of crying over, but you don't get that. And that's the thing that really hits you. We're not going to give you the satisfaction of seeing this man get mourned. We're going to see him as a victim of this violence. He's going to be, of course, I'm going to mess up who had the quote. This one might have been Jordan Peele as well, or it might have been an editorial I was looking at. But the equation that was given was black hero equals dead hero. So Ben, as long as he was the black hero, could not survive. He couldn't make it past that night, because you as an audience need to be reminded of history. In whether you want to be reminded of or want to think of it in those terms or not, that's what happened, at least to Ben.
But again, Ben was written without knowing who would be cast.
Right.
And that was the ending either way.
Right. But what I'm saying is that's how it's going to be seen.
One of the social commentary aspects of this film that is solely put on by the audience watching it and when they're watching it really got to me. Number one, he hits a woman. Number two, when the child zombie attacks from behind, hi, Karen. Karen gets picked up and thrown onto the couch. And while it's fantastic in the moment and it works great in the story, I was thinking about how today, if you picked up a child and threw them, somebody would have an issue with it. And they'd be like, did you see what this movie did? Oh my God. Because
wait till they see Ready or Not.
We don't see, fantastic movie. We don't seem to be able to accept that actors are told what's going to happen, or that, he probably didn't really punch Barbara in the face. It bothers me how we get stuck on these things today. And in the 60s, number one, it was commonplace to hit a woman or anybody else for that matter.
Well, I would say it wasn't necessarily commonplace. It wasn't looked down upon to the same degree as now.
That's true, because it's commonplace now, too.
Because domestic abuse was still an issue. It just wasn't, how can I put this? It didn't get the same attention that it would get today. Almost acceptable on screen because it was more commonplace to see on screen in the 60s and 50s than it is today. Not that it was more accepted.
And everybody was used to that and not a decomposing skull. Speaking of horror, I absolutely love the build up to the child dying. Like, the entire movie, looking at it from our point of view now, everyone watching this is like, she's down there where they can't get out, and they keep talking about how there's only one way out.
Right.
We know she's sick and not doing well. We're told she was bitten by one of the ghouls, which in this film doesn't really matter as much because anybody who dies is going to rise. But it's ingrained in us now that if it's a zombie movie, being bit, your clock is ticking.
Right.
So every single thing is pointing to what's going to happen with this girl. She's going to die and she's going to rise. And what I liked so much rewatching it today was that while we know it's coming, they don't show that part. They don't show her die. They don't show her get reanimated and pop up. Her mom walks downstairs and sees her eating Mr. Cooper's dead body. And it's so much more powerful that way. It's like, we all know what happened. We don't need to see it.
Right.
Like, getting hit with that is so much more powerful. And I loved that. I thought that was an excellent use of horror. Also, the dead body at the top of the stairs that I talked about earlier, the different reactions to it. Barbara is terrified of it to the point that she runs out of the house. Whereas when Ben gets there, he's just like, that's unfortunate. And he's a little grossed out, but he moves her out of the way because he knows they're going to have to walk through there a lot.
Right.
So that was fascinating to me as well. And I would have kind of liked to see some of the other reactions, but we also, like, we know Tommy saw her at some point because he says, we were the ones that found the people upstairs. I'm not sure what his response was. It obviously wasn't to move her out of the way, but it just, I really like how different people react to the different horror because horror is such an individualized thing. So then we have Barbara's death scene. Johnny dies at the beginning, and we have no idea if he's dead or if he's alive or whatever. And then all of a sudden, and he's back. I absolutely love how it affects Barbara to the point that she stops fighting. She's not a strong fighter to begin with, but she's putting up enough to stay alive. And then when she sees Johnny, she's so drained that she just gets pulled out of the house and eaten. And I thought that was such a great use of Barbara's character because we've seen her snapping this whole time and just being unable to deal with any of it, just even talking about it. But then when she sees Johnny and she sees that he's dead, she gives up completely. And yeah, that's pure horror to me.
Well, and that speaks to how we would all react in that situation. I mean, as far as the different ways that people react. You know, who's gonna keep it together? Who's the person who's gonna freak out? Who's the person who's gonna give up? Who's the person who's gonna get killed immediately? And who's the person who's gonna say, you know what? We don't all need to be together. I need to find someplace else to go. Which you see, at least in the zombie genre, where there's always that discussion about, we need to stay here. No, we need to leave. Well, you know what? Fuck you guys. We're staying here because if we leave, we're all gonna die.
I love that there's always that fight. Like, there's all this crazy shit happening outside, and humans still have to fight with each other. Let's go downstairs. No, let's stay upstairs. Why the fuck do you have to be together? Go do your own thing. You know, but we take the time to fight over it, no matter what.
That gets into so many other dynamics as far as, in a crisis situation, who's in charge? I mean, absent someone in authority, who's in charge? Does it become the person who decides, I'm going to take charge? Or is the person that, you know, you kind of already have this idea that this is an authoritative figure or a figure of authority because of how they look, how they sound, how they're dressed? Because we do kind of have, or at least we do kind of rely on outward appearance in a lot of cases to defer authority.
Well, and they did a good job with Mr. Cooper as well, because he shows that he shouldn't be in charge through most of his actions throughout the film. But there's this part where he's downstairs with his wife after he's decided to board it up and they're going to stay down there. She says, that's important, isn't it? To be right while everyone else is wrong. And I love that because it says so much about their dynamic together. It says so much about him, and he stays true to that the entire time. Like, he's not willing to be the hero, but then he's willing to sacrifice others, or he's willing to grab the gun because he wants to be the hero, even though he doesn't want to put in the work. And it all comes back to that line for me with him.
You don't necessarily need to identify with what created this film or even the time period around this film, because what's taking place on screen are things that you can relate to within your life, or you could kind of build up your own scenarios of other things that could be taking place. I had the pleasure of speaking with Max Brooks a few years ago, who is the author of World War Z, the Zombie Survival Guide, I think is the other one, and Zombie Outbreak Survival Guide. I can't remember the full title of it. And the Harlem Hellfighters. And when we spoke, he talked about the whole reason of him writing that book. You know, there's a bunch of different issues that were involved, but the central one was all the stuff in the book, especially the survival guide, is stuff that's based off of reality. He just threw zombies in because, you know, it make for a much better story. But all these things, as far as survival, you can apply the zombie films to a volcano, an earthquake, a flooding, a tsunami, a hurricane, tornado, civil strife, civil unrest, riots. There are all these things that a zombie film or a zombie story can be inserted in. We don't have to say war. We can just have it's us against the zombies. We're fighting against them, which makes it very popular within the gaming culture, especially things like Call of Duty, because it seems like, I guess for the last 10 years or so, since Call of Duty's been on things like PlayStation and Xbox, or however long it's been on there, you've often had a zombie-themed portion of the game. And it comes down to a lot of iterations come down to survival. So you can build your own teams. You're in a farmhouse, you're out on a battlefield, wherever you are. I think there was one where you're trying to catch a bus to the next town. But it's all about surviving, and you have to trust all these other people that are on your team from around the world or within your own network to get out of that situation. And it comes down to things like, oh, there's a gun over there, and trying to get to the gun before this other person. Or if a zombie attacks them, is this person going to let me die and then they take all my shit? Once my body's on the ground, they're going to take all my ammo, take my medical kits and things like that. Because it shows, at least partially, at least in the virtual world, it shows what human nature is. I'm going to do what I can to survive. If we don't have a close attachment, it's going to be you or me. And when you talk about horror, as far as the last part of the film, the horror for me in this film is human nature. This idea that you can't trust people, or you can't have enough trust in people, and sometimes people that you know, but definitely people that you don't know. You can't have enough trust in them to survive.
Overall, I am absolutely amazed at everything that this film influenced, how it built zombies as we know them, how it influenced all slasher movies. Take a look at Jason and you can track it back to this. Just everything that he did. And when you really look at what they were doing going into this, it's crazy that it was even made. They couldn't get it funded. They got 10 people together and they each kicked in $600. They didn't have enough money to finish filming it. And they just kept going. And the cast was cool with it, hoping that it would work out. They would film some scenes and then show people to get further sponsorship to keep building this movie. And then it does these amazing things where it keeps rising from the dead. It's always here and it's always relevant. And that in and of itself is just amazing. There's nothing about this film that feels out of place watching it today. Unless you count, using actual landlines. But that's about it. You have these unstoppable monsters that look like us. You have so much horror. You have so much social commentary. And you have all of the commentary that we add to it watching it. Speaking of monsters who look like us and who are basically unstoppable, next week, we're going to have a special guest. Here's a spoiler.
This is my favorite movie in sci-fi ever.
Next week, we're going to talk Terminator. Terminator 1, Terminator 2, and then we're going to ignore all the other bullshit in the Terminator universe.
The only movie that has screwed up time travel more than Terminator, or the Terminator series, is probably Back to the Future and Avengers Endgame. Yeah, next we're going to talk about Terminator, the whole issue of automation, drones, self-driving cars, all this stuff that when we were in the 1980s and this movie came out, people said, bullshit, they'll never be able to do that. And here we are ordering everything possible through little handheld devices. We have driverless vehicles on the roads. We have drones that are involved in warfare. We have satellites.
And delivering our mail.
We have drones that you can actually just take and spy on people.
And we have sex robots that aren't programmed correctly and are strangling people. That's a real thing. Look it up. Terminator is here, people. But before we can talk Terminator next week, first, we're taking a little bit of a road trip. You want to tell them about it, Don?
Well, I don't know about you, man. I'm flying.
That's true. So am I. I guess it's not a road trip.
Yeah, yes. We're going to be traveling. We will be at FanX in Salt Lake City, Utah this weekend. James, you want to tell them about our panels?
I will be there Thursday with a panel on plotting, outlining, and pacing your novel. And then on Friday, when Don arrives, we're going to do Terrors of the 2020s, where we talk about where we think horror is heading in the next decade.
I have my panel on film as history, which talks about using movies as a device to teach history, use it as a historical artifact, and even to mis-teach history, if that's a word.
If it's not, it should be. And then we additionally have Making Light of the Dark, Humor in Horror, and how those two things work together. On Saturday, I have a panel with horror legend Jonathan Mayberry, which I am very much looking forward to, as well as James A. Owen and a couple other great people on this panel. It's basically authors talking about having your work turned into film, whether it's on the indie level or short films or going all the way to Hollywood, and how those things work. Then that night, Saturday night, we have horror as social commentary, which I think some of you might have heard of.
Yeah, we're trying all new stuff now. But
absolutely,
more importantly than just coming and listen to us at those panels, we're going to have a table set up. James is going to have his books. I'm going to have mine. And stickers, buttons. We'll have all types of cool stuff that you can come get from us. If you are in the Salt Lake City area and you are planning on going to FanX, please feel free to come to the panels, come by the table, say hello, take a picture, or buy us a drink.
Yeah, that's important. If you're in Salt Lake and you're not going to FanX, you should at least come down to the bar. Don needs help with his beer bill, and I need hot wings, so it's important that you come out for that.
And plus, we might need a fourth on The Simpsons at that arcade that you were talking about.
Quarters Arcade. They're like the opposite of a sponsor, because I'm going to blow so much money there.
Works for me. There are worse things you could spend money on than arcades.
Right? Anyway, so join us next week when we talk Terminator, and until then, we hope you have a great week. Thank you for tuning in to thenecronama.com. As always, I am James Sabata.
And I'm Don Guillory.
And this is where we insert music, and it's pretty fantastic.